So Wei Yang, you will have 40 minutes. And so as usual, so you can post the question in the chat and Wei Yang will stop to take some of the questions, or his co-author Kyle will answer the questions in the chat. So Wei Yang, like, the floor is yours. Thank you. So
Sorry,
yeah.
thanks so much. Yeah, sorry, I need to mute. Yeah, Kyle will take questions and in the chat, and I'll try to pause at certain points. If I go on too long, organizers can feel free to stop me. So yeah, so I'm excited to present Money, Time, and Grant Design. This is joint work with Kyle Myers. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I know a lot of people are actually on holiday today. So let me get started. So this work is actually, oh geez, okay. So yeah, so the motivation for this paper really comes from this idea you see among science funders that the design of grants might be something that can be used to steer the kind of work that researchers do. And in particular, one kind of hypothesis you see is that giving people longer grants might be able to spur them to do more risk taking. So, for example, here's a quote from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which gives out some of the most prestigious grants in biomedical research, and they talk about how they extended the grant from 5 years to 7 years, with the idea that this stable support will allow the researchers to take more risk. Here are a couple more quotes from prominent funders, the Wellcome Trust and the National Institutes of Health in the US, talking about how they're trying out longer grants with the hope that this will lead to bold projects and give researchers more freedom to innovate and explore new lines of inquiry. And this is something, it's not just funders, so researchers themselves also seem to value this to some extent. So the NIH is actually piloting a program like this, and these are some quotes from participants in that program talking about how they were happy to trade off funding for more stability. And one of the reasons they give is that it allows them to it helps them with hiring, basically. It allows them to make a commitment to, for example, a new postdoc, because they know that the funding will be there for a longer period of time. Here's a little bit of informal evidence from a Twitter poll of NIH investigators, where 80% of them basically say that they're happy to never apply for another NIH grant if they guaranteed a certain level of funding for the rest of their career. And as one of them puts it, they're pretty happy to take one marshmallow a year over a 5% chance of 3 marshmallows after spending some X hours writing marshmallow proposals. So are funders' intuitions right? And can grant design be a policy tool? So it's helpful to kind of take a step back here and try and think about what we do know about this area. And this all really kind of ties into a much broader question of underinvestment in innovation. And so some of what we know from that literature in terms of theory and from lab experiments is that failure-tolerant incentive schemes do seem to be able to incentivize exploration. We have some empirical evidence from firms that long-term incentives like stock options do seem to lead to more innovation. And most directly related to what we're doing today is some work on how prestigious risk-tolerant grants encourage elite scientists to take more big swings in their work. So, and I think that helps to illuminate a couple of challenges in trying to dig deeper into this question. So one thing is that grants differ on many dimensions. So, so for what we're going to do today, we're really going to try to drill down on 2 things that are very intuitive to a lot of scientists, which is amount, which is the amount of money in the grant, and the duration, which is the number of years that the money is accessible. But there are a lot of other things that grants can vary on, which, things like how can you use the money, what are the reporting requirements, and the prestige. And these are all things that are very hard to shut down usually for example, if you're looking at do people who get a certain kind of or awarded a certain kind of grant, it's very hard to shut down the prestige channel. Another challenge is that the space of research grant design is underexplored. So this is a graph from the Dimensions database. For our purposes, we can sort of think of this as a universe of grants, and this is the distribution of grants on two dimensions, on the size of the grant and the duration. And what we see basically is that we don't see a lot of grants that are small but long or big but short. And in the sort of darker areas of the graph, the grant size and duration also tend to be highly correlated. So if we think about how we want to sort of get more precise answers about this question, we can think about, well, okay, maybe you have a field experiment where you randomly distribute grants of different sizes and durations, which is, I don't want to say impossible, but as you imagine, there are a lot of constraints, cost being probably one of the first ones that comes to mind. Now, is there perhaps a natural experiment? Well, as we just saw, there's just not that much variation. These two dimensions just tend to be very correlated. So what we're going to do is to embed two thought experiments in a survey of US professors. And we're going to try to get at two questions using these thought experiments. The first question is, can grant design change researchers' strategies? And in this experiment, we basically ask researchers to imagine getting a grant of some random size and duration, and then we ask them, how would you change your research? The second question is trying to get at researchers' preferences for grant size for the situation, because we want to understand, okay, even if you started a program with longer grants, for example, who are the kinds of researchers who would select into those programs? And in this thought experiment, essentially what we're doing is asking researchers to make a trade-off and ask them, how much less grant funding would you accept for a longer grant? So to preview our results, what we find is that longer grants don't actually seem to increase risk-taking except among tenured professors. And another thing you see is that larger grants, in terms of the amount of money, seems to lead to more expanding of ongoing projects, whereas smaller grants seem to lead to more starting of new projects. So so larger grants lead to more exploiting, and smaller grants seem to lead to more exploring. And what we find in terms of research preferences is that they seem to value money a lot more than duration, about 3 to 4 times more. Okay, so let me pause for a sec. Any questions here? Okay. I think I'll move on then. So let me talk a bit about the data we're using here. Sorry, yeah, the data. So the data we're using here is the National Survey of Academic Researchers. So this is something we've been working for the last few years, and as you can see, there's a big team that's been behind this. The population we're targeting here is professors who are research active at major US institutions of higher education. We are going to first find about 150 of the largest US institutions based on the total R&D spending. We're going to go to each of these institutions' websites, find individuals who are listed as a professor, and then grab the name, email, rank, department. And this is going to give us about 260,000 unique emails. From this population, we're going to sample half of the emails, and we're going to sample within field of study and their rank, so whether they're associate, assistant, full. And we sent out 130,000 email invites. Over 4,000 of these are completed, and we're going to narrow it down to people who say they spend more at least some of their time on research. So this leaves us about 4,100 research active professors. All right. So a very natural concern here is, okay, are the people who respond to this just like a very weird subsample of the population? So we're going to do a number of things to try and address this. First, one of the things we've done is to randomize incentives and reminders to the people we invite. The incentive arms are basically nothing, a gift card, a lottery, sorry, not lottery. So that should say charity, or both a gift card and a charity, and a donation. Sorry, so we make a donation on their behalf. The other thing we randomize is the number of reminders, so that you can get 0 to 2 reminders. And the nice thing about randomizing this, instead of sort of, trying to throw all the incentives at everyone, is that we can use these as instruments in a Heckman correction model. And the long story short is that when we do this correction, we don't really seem to find nothing doesn't seem to change. The coefficient under the inverse Mills ratio is usually small and insignificant, statistically insignificant. Again, the incentives and reminders they both seem to work. They both seem to have some bite and increase response rate. So that's for the Heckman correction, that's very useful. A few other things we're going to do is to look at whether the sample looks similar to the population based on observables. So this graph shows the institutions that across different the institutions that respondents come from. So for example, the top left graph, that is institution rank by funding from all sources, and the gray bars are the distribution of respondents institutions that we emailed, right? And then we break it down further down. So the next graph is institution ranking based on federal funding only, and so on. And basically what we see is that these with the pink lines here is a distribution for the people who actually completed the survey. And we see that these are actually pretty similar. There's maybe slight underrepresentation at the at the top ranks, but over the average difference is about a 3 to 5% difference. We also look at things at the individual level. So again, the gray bars here are the publication citation counts, grant counts, and amount of grant funding for the people we invited to take the survey. And when we overlay the distribution for people who completed the survey, these are again pretty similar. And then one more thing we do is that in the survey we ask people about their salary. And so another thing we're able to do is for people who come from public institutions that have public salary data, we were able to download this data and match them up to the respondents. And what we see is that the salary that people report and the publicly reported salary are actually pretty highly correlated. There's a little bit of outward, there's at the bottom end of the distribution, the public salary is a little bit higher than the reported salary. So the other way around. The reported salary is a bit higher than the public salary. So there could be a couple of things going on here. There might be some lag because it's public data, so there might be some lag between the public data and the self-report. There could possibly be a little bit of behavioral bias, but there could also just be some, with it, when the public data, it doesn't capture all sources of payment from the university. Okay, so quick takeaway is for sample selection is, we do a Heckman correction. Things look similar on observables, and when we look at the salary data, at the very least, it seems like respondents are trying to answer these honestly. Okay, so let me pause here. Any questions here? Okay, great. So let me dive into the two experiments. So again, the first experiment, the question we're trying to get at is, can grand design change researchers' strategies? So we're going to start off with a thought experiment, and we basically asked the researcher to imagine that you've received a grant of some size S and duration D, right? So the size here is drawn from a from a range of 100,000 to $2 million. The duration here is drawn from a range of 2 to 10 years. And then we asked the researcher to select 2 of the following 5 options as the most important changes that getting this grant would enable them to do. So the options are, they can increase the size of their ongoing projects. They can increase the accuracy of their projects. They can increase the speed. They can pursue projects that are less related to their current work. And they can pursue riskier projects. So this is what it looks like, the actual survey looks like. So let me just kind of set up the estimation, how the results are going to look. So the estimation, that question we're trying to answer is, when a researcher is given a certain grant of a certain size and duration, do they choose a particular strategy J? So you can think of this as, on the left-hand side, we have an indicator for whether you chose one of the 5 strategies. And on the right-hand side, we have a function of grant characteristics and individual covariates and error term, of course. So basically, we're going to have 5 different regressions, one for each of the strategy options that we show them. The main specification here is basically a very simple linear probability model. Later on, we'll do something with causal forests, which I'll talk a little bit about. But for now, just think of it as a linear probability model. Right. So, okay. So let's dive into the results here. So what this table shows us, if you look at the highlighted part, these are basically semi-elasticities. So the first column tells us that for a 1% increase in duration, respondents are 1 percentage point more likely to say that they'll take more risk. You can see that this result's pretty imprecise. And then the coefficient below that tells us that for a 1% increase in amount, respondents are 1.7 percentage points more likely to say that they'll take more risk. So takeaway here is, more money seems to lead to more risk taking. Duration has no effect. Now, the other thing, if you go to the next column, what we see is that both more money and more time seem to lead to less speed, or less emphasis on speed. So in a way, this is somewhat intuitive, right? Like, more resources and more time, maybe there's less need to do things as quickly, and which may be a good thing. I think our point here is more. I think so. A takeaway here, a useful takeaway here, is that there's possibly some trade-offs here involved in giving more money or more time. We don't take a stand on what the optimal trade-off is, but it's useful to consider that there might be some. If you go to the next 2 columns, not much happening in duration. What we do see is that as researchers get more money, they're more likely to say they'll expand, they'll make their ongoing projects larger, and they're less likely to say they'll go in new directions. Or to put it differently, as they get smaller grants, they're more likely to go into new directions and explore new projects. So I kind of just want to pause here a little bit and talk a bit more about this result. So we think that's an interesting contrast here with a paper by Krieger, Lee, and Papanikolaou about how when firms have sort of windfalls, they're more likely to produce they're more likely to produce more novel drugs, and which is pretty intuitive. And so one of the things we want to sort of try and dig into is to think about why our results seem to be contradictory. So another result we have in the paper, which I won't go into a lot of detail here, but also I mentioned the headline, is that when we give people, or when we hypothetically give people more money, what they say is that they will spend more on their own salary and training relative to spending on other people's salaries. So just to be clear, they're not saying they'll spend less on people's salaries, but it's sort of a proportional increase. Now, why exactly this might be, we don't know. So there could be labor supply constraints, for example. Maybe as you know, it just gets, as you have more and more money, it's just harder and harder to find the right people to hire. There could be demand side constraints in the sense that maybe as I get more and more money, it's just the managerial frictions. It's just harder to manage bigger teams, harder to manage multiple projects. So one possibility here is that there's some combination of there's constraints to team expansion, and there's some risk aversion about how you use such a big amount of money that lead to this result we have about, you know, if you have more money, then you're more likely to keep expanding your own project instead of exploring new areas. We'll sort of state a caveat here, which that you know, our experiment doesn't explicitly test this. So because the thing with randomizing is grant design and not grant inputs. So there could be other things changing as well. Okay, and then finally, the last thing we see is the accuracy just doesn't seem to be affected by either dimension. And actually, if you look at the third row, you can see that it's also usually it's the least selected option, suggesting so why exactly this is, maybe it's just that, you know, scientists is kind of in their minds think of their work as meeting as a high standard of accuracy all the time anyway, and they sort of don't think that, or don't want to think that that would change. And then I'll pause right after this, but another thing we do, since we have, you know, quite a few outcomes here, is we're going to adjust for multiple hypothesis testing. And after you do that, at standard levels of significance, the things that survive are the results that longer duration and more money lead to less speed, and more money leads to more expanding of ongoing projects. So let me pause here before I keep going. Yeah, can I answer?
Question? Yeah, you have a question from Melanie in the chat. Yeah, Melanie, if you want to ask.
I think Kyle just answered it, but I mean, maybe I'll just rephrase it in general. Are you going to be able to talk at all about kind of differences across fields of, like, I imagine that in some, so immediately by thinking when you're talking about funding your own salary, there's no world in which I would fund my own salary with grants. And so, like, that doesn't seem applicable to me. Does that mean that all these results are driven by lab sciences? More generally, can we learn a lot by looking at differences, heterogeneity across fields where labor usage is very different and so forth? Are you going to go there, or?
Yes, we're going to go there right away.
Power,
no, we're going to, so let me know. Yeah, we'll go there right away.
So, and I had like a related question. So do you also like correlate, you know, these different answers with the individual characteristics of the respondents? I mean, I guess it would be interesting to look at that too.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about that right next, the next slide, and let me know what you think about it. Yeah. So oh yes, okay. So yeah, so let me sort of jump back to the very beginning of the results part, where we had this result about how longer grants don't seem to lead to the more risk taking. And as I kind of alluded to at the beginning, that there does seem to be a fair amount of literature that suggests that this would work. So, and that's the next thing we wanted to kind of dig into is, okay, what's going on here? Is this really just is it really just zero? Is it really just noise? Or is there more going on? And so what we're going to do is we're going to re-estimate all of those results with but particularly here, I'm going to talk about the re-estimation with the risk-taking. We're going to do this with the causal forest method. And basically what this does is first it's going to give us a distribution of treatment effects. So these are conditional average treatment effects conditional on covariates. And then this is going to give us a distribution of effects. And what we're going to be able to do is take this distribution and do what's called a best linear projection of the treatment effects on our covariates. So this including things like field, things like soft money, demographics, and basically see, okay, what are the characteristics that are correlated with higher treatment effects. And so let me first show you what we see. So this is the distribution of treatment effects for the strategy of risk-taking, right? And so the dark blue dotted line, that's the distribution of, or let me start with, the dark blue dotted line is the distribution of treatment effects for the duration coefficients, and the light blue line is the distribution for the amount coefficients. And as you can see, the spread is very, very wide for the duration estimates. And the sort of high level takeaway when we do this is that we don't see much happening with across fields, but the thing that this really pops out is that it's tenured researchers who have the higher treatment effects. So basically, tenured researchers are the ones who say that they will take more risks with longer grants. And to kind of reconcile this with a paper by Pierre Azoulay, Josh Grosivin, and Gustavo Manso, who find that what they find is that recipients of prestigious Howard Hughes Medical Institute grants tend to take more risks, explore more after they receive those grants. And we think that's consistent in the sense that people who receive the HHMI grant and people who are in contention to receive those grants, who form the control group in that paper, are also probably people who have high job security, because they, okay, so before I move on, so let me pause here again before I move on to the second experiment.
No question.
Okay.
In the chat. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Great. So so then let me go on to the second experiment. So again, this one's about what are researchers' preferences for grant size versus duration. So in this experiment, again, we're going to start with a thought experiment, and we're going to show researchers a short grant. So this is a grant where the size is drawn from 100K to $2 million again, but the duration here is only drawn from 2 to 5 years. And then we're going to show them a long grant with a duration drawn from 6 to 10 years. But then we're going to ask them, what's the size of this grant that would make you indifferent between the short grant and the long grant? So this is what it looks like in the actual survey. So, and we're going to just use a very simple model of grant preferences here. We're going to assume that researchers have get some utility over grant size and duration. And this is just a Cobb-Douglas. So there's the alpha in the equation is, you think of as a taste shifter. So this is the absolute value of grant funding to a person. And then our primary, the thing we're interested in here is the superscripts, the gammas here, which tell us how people value grant size versus duration. So, right, okay. So here on this graph, what we have, this is the average short grant that we show the respondents. And then the dotted line shows the average length of the long grant that we show them. And then they have to choose the size of the grant that will make them indifferent. And this is the average response that our respondents give. And so our goal, right, is to find the indifference curve that connects these 2 points. And using the Cobb-Douglas function, what we find is that basically people like money a lot more. So the gamma is pretty high, 0.78. And you can see this indifference curve is quite steep. If you draw the rest of the indifference curves throughout the graph, you can kind of see on the left-hand side, it's as grant amount increases, grant duration just doesn't change much. And it's only once you get to around $1 million and more that you kind of see the indifference curve start to actually have some start to curve, actually starts to look like a curve. Yeah. And to put this in more quantitative forms, what it tells us is that to these people, money is about 3 to 4 times more valuable than time. The implied marginal rate of substitution here is about 40 to 50K per year. Yeah, so a natural question here again is, okay, how does this look across different subgroups? And there's some differences. So first we estimate these separately by broad fields, of which we have 4. So we see that the strongest preferences for money relative to time is in the natural sciences and also in medical and health sciences as well. But even in the other 2 broad groups, so the social sciences and humanities, the preference for money is still 3 times more than the preference for time. We also see we do some additional cuts where we along different dimensions. So, for example, what we do see is that older respondents are more likely to prefer larger grants. So, can think of age as a proxy for discount factor, and with older people having higher discount factors. People who do more capital intensive research also have stronger preferences for larger grants. Again, very intuitive. And then similarly for risk takers and less effective fundraisers. But even so, there are these differences, but even across all these different subgroups, the lowest gamma, the implication is that the respondents prefer money at least 3 times more than time. So overall, there still seems to be a pretty strong preference for money. Okay, so let me pause before I jump to the summary.
I think you're good, but you have like 5 minutes left.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just kind of recap, what we find is that longer grants, they seem to be able to incentivize risk taking, but only among the tenured. So suggesting that grant duration and tenure or some form of job security are complementary incentives. We see that bigger grants seem to incentivize expanding current work. As we talked about, this is a little bit speculative, but this could be possibly related to some combination of the constraints to team expansion and risk aversion. And overall, researchers seem to just have much stronger preferences for money compared to time. And this might explain why we don't see a lot of sort of insurance style grants that are very long, but relatively small in terms of amount. So yeah, and so let me wrap up here with sort of just a quick, I guess, plug that I'm on the job market. So if you have a job, I would take one. But otherwise, I'm very thankful for your time and happy to take any more questions or hand it over to Carolyn.
Thank you very much. So do we have any questions? No. Okay, so Caroline, maybe you want to share your screen?
Let me stop.
And I think you're on mute.
That's okay, because I'm just muttering to myself about what I need to do.
Okay.
Okay. Full screen this. Share screen. Okay.
Thank you. And you have 15 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper. I was really happy to have the chance to read it, especially this week, because I just feel like this paper could not be more relevant or more timely in light of what I would call like growing interest in better ways to fund science, as we, I think, become more and more convinced that the status quo may not be optimal. So, you know, what was sort of like the relevant news that came out this week was that Katie Carrico and her collaborator, Dr. Weissman, I think at Penn, won the Nobel Prize for mRNA vaccines. And the sort of like story that everyone's running is that, you know, she had a very difficult career because the NIH in particular was constantly rejecting her grant applications. And how could this have happened? You know, like something seems like it's very flawed in the way we allocate funding in science. And then also, like, interestingly, a week or two ago, you know, the National Science Foundation came out with this news that they are now going to explicitly try to engage in research around like what is the best way to fund science, and exploring with alternative models of grant making. And so I just think that this is super exciting, and it's an area where there's very little research. And it's really exciting to hear that these agencies are like willing to start experimenting. But, you know, if you were to ask me, like, what's the first experiment they should run? I think actually we have so little evidence that even that question is hard to answer. It's not even clear, like, what is the most promising, you know, sort of set of things we might want to try, which is why I think research like this actually is so important, because it can help guide these types of early experiments. And, you know, I just think it's, to me, I'm not at all a historian. I really don't know very much about this, but just like casual reflection, I would guess that the sort of way we do things now, there's really no reason to think it's optimal, because the current system we have was not, in my understanding, so much like carefully designed as it just sort of evolved. I mean, like in the 16th century, you had people like Galileo, who had, you know, wealthy people like the Medici family as their patrons, who were just sort of funding their scientific work the same way that they maybe like funded artists to do art. And then from there, in the early 20th century, as far as I can tell, it seems like research at universities was mostly funded by a mix of tuition, private philanthropy, and occasional grants from industry. And then it was really only in the mid-20th century, following the very successful government contracts that were made between the US government and a lot of universities to do sort of innovation for World War II. That was what set the stage for large-scale federal funding of basic science. But it, you know, it sort of kind of just seems to me like this sort of just evolved. Nobody ever stepped back and said, like, you know, what's the right way to do this that aligns everybody's incentives and sort of promotes the most and best science we can do with a limited budget? I don't think that conversation has really been had. And so it just seems like it's quite possible that making changes to the way we give out grants could sort of, for the same amount of money, lead to more and better science. And I think that possibility is really exciting. And so when I think about like, what does grant design mean? In my mind, there's sort of like 3 phases where you could imagine this happening. So the first phase would be like, how do we evaluate grant proposals? How do we choose projects that have yet to be done to fund? So, you know, questions I think that would fall under this bucket are things like, should we fund more projects that look like they're very high risk, like they might not work out, but if they did work out would be really a big deal. You know, another question you might think falls under this framework is, should we allocate grants via a lottery, which there's been some experiments around doing that. Should we constrain the number of grants we let a single PI have at a given time, which is something that the NIH has started doing. But again, I don't think with a ton of evidence to inform that decision. The second bucket, which is, I think, sort of the set of questions that this project is asking about, is once we've given somebody a grant, how should that grant itself be structured? So questions like, you know, what amount should we give people? How long should we let them have access to it? So those are the exact two questions that are being addressed by this paper. Something else that might fall under this bucket, although sort of not the topic of this paper, is how flexible should we let these grants be? Like, do you have to really stick to what you put in the proposal? Or if that's not looking promising, but you learn some new stuff along the way, do you have the freedom to pivot? And then I would say the last bucket would be, you know, ex post, how do we define success? Is success you did what you said you were going to do? Or is success, you know, you failed, but like learned a lot along the way that was useful for you or useful for other people? And then how does that success or failure going to influence the probability that you're either able to renew that grant or successfully apply for a new grant? So that's just sort of my categorization, but I just want to highlight there's like a lot of questions in this space, and this is sort of where I see this paper fitting in. Okay, so to just briefly summarize, I don't want to just be too repetitive, but I want to highlight a couple of things. I think the implementation of this, whoops, I see my greater than sign didn't render correctly. The implementation of this survey is really impressive. You know, I've run some surveys myself, and we didn't do nearly the sort of amount of work that these authors did to assess sort of first whether the responses were accurate, which they did by trying to match up self-reported income to administrative income from public universities. And then also a lot of work linking the sample back to administrative data sources to try to see if the respondents looked similar on covariates relative to sort of the full sample they were pulling from. And things look really good, but I just think, like, you know, when you have a 4% response rate, which my understanding is that's pretty par for the course in this type of survey, I just think it brings a lot of credibility to what you say afterwards if you take this time to sort of validate the responses to your survey. So I thought that was really impressive, and just I really appreciated it. Oops. And then the sort of first part of the paper provides authors with these hypothetical grants where they've randomized both the amount A and the duration D. And they ask them, conditional on getting this grant that has these randomized attributes, are you more likely to do one of these 5 things? And these 5 things are work faster, work on riskier projects, start projects in new areas, increase the size of ongoing projects, and increase the accuracy of the work, which, as was brought up in the comments, I think is like spend additional resources to increase the probability that your work is replicatable. And I think they ask authors to choose 2 of these 5. And what they find is that on average, bigger grants look like they lead to slower work, taking on more risk, and increasing ongoing projects. Longer grants lead to slower work. But the heterogeneity here is really interesting. For example, there's sort of no statistically significant effect in the average on longer grants leading to more risk taking, but there's a lot of heterogeneity. And in particular, it looks like people who have tenure, if you offer those people longer grants, they do take on more risk. And I think that that just really speaks to the fact that any type of grant design you do has to interact with all these other existing systems that we have in academia. And you can tell someone, look, with this grant, you have all the time in the world. But if that person is going up for tenure in 3 years, you cannot give them all the time in the world, no matter how long you make that grant. So you really do need to think very carefully about how sort of the design of grants is going to interact with all these other systems that are in place. And I just thought that was like a really interesting point that came out of that And then the next exercise the authors do is they show the respondents 2 grants. Grant 1 has a randomly drawn amount and a randomly drawn duration. The second grant also has a randomly drawn duration, but it's going to be longer than the duration of the first grant. And they ask the researchers to just choose the amount that would make them indifferent between the 2 grants. And with that choice data in hand, they can basically estimate a sort of Cobb-Douglas utility function that will tell you sort of how much amount is valued relative to duration. And the results suggest that, amount matters a lot more. Although as you get to larger and larger, as you go down this x-axis and you get to large amounts, you can kind of see just through the Cobb-Doug functional form, duration does start to matter more. Okay, so that's sort of a summary of the paper. I have 2 points that I just wanted to ask about. So actually, the first one I was a little bit hesitant to ask about because I wasn't sure if I was confused about this only because of my own ignorance and how most grants are administered. But I spent some time reading and I couldn't find an answer. Maybe those of you who are on Zoom and have big grants will just know the answer. But in this paper, grants are modeled as basically having a total amount A, and then there's a duration. But the way you should think about this, I think, in the context of the survey, is that you can access the full amount of that grant at any time. So, in other words, you could spend it all in year 1 if you wanted. So that means that, given the choice, you'd always prefer to have $100 over 5 years to having $100 over 4 years, because it's just additional flexibility. And I wasn't sure if that's how all grants are structured. If it was instead structured that it's just doled out to you in equal amounts over those time horizons, then it's like not obvious at all that $20 per year for 5 years is going to be preferable to $25 a year for 4 years. And I wasn't sure which model, whether grants sort of all fall under one model or the other. The sort of best I could understand is that when you apply for an R01 grant, you give them a per year budget. But you can't go over $500,000 a year in any one year without special permission. So for example, if you want to buy in the first year a really expensive piece of equipment that's going to cost more than $500,000, and then you want very little in the other years, you need to get special permission for that. And I wasn't sure how much flexibility you have to go over the budget if sort of unexpected things come up. But I just thought that sort of that distinction does matter in terms of how people will think about duration. I think in your survey, it probably was very clear, but I wasn't sure if that's another interesting feature of grant design that might be something to consider. But the answer just may be even if you submit these annual budgets, you can always ask to spend it early, in which case the sort of first way of thinking about it is probably for all intents and purposes the right way. So this was more of a question. I was just curious. And I was thinking that, you may want to just clarify it because there may be more people like me who are a little bit ignorant on this point. Okay. And then the other interesting thing that your results made me think about, which are sort of beyond the scope of this paper, but I just thought were interesting, is that researcher preferences and social planner preferences may not be aligned. And you never claim that they are, but you sort of had some results actually in the paper that I think suggest they probably are not. So, I think researchers Unconstrained are going to want bigger and longer grants. And the question is, if that's sort of, you have that information, should you as a social planner honor those preferences? And I don't know necessarily what the social planner objective function is, but there is some interesting results that are in the paper about what would researchers do with the grant money if they get bigger or longer grants. And, we've already seen that they're going to work more slowly without necessarily making their work more accurate. So I would interpret that as they basically expend less costly effort to rush. You can do the same amount of work in 1 year or 2 years, but it's going to be more painful to do it in 1 year. So they'll sort of expend less costly effort to do their work quickly. And also they'll increase the share of the grant that's spent on their own salary. Both of those things seem most likely are not aligned with what a social planner would want. And so I just think it highlights, often you read these editorials written by scientists about all the ways that science is wrong. And I just think it's like important to remember that these are like from the scientist's perspective, which just may not be the social planner's perspective. Scientists will say, oh, it's terrible, like we have to work so hard. But as a society, we probably like scientists working very hard. So I just think this paper sort of brings to light some things that are like interesting to think about. And you may not want scientists sort of say, you don't want to design grants to sort of optimally please scientists. The goal is to design grants to sort of maximize social welfare, and those two things just may not be the same. And this paper sort of reminded me of that point, and I thought that that's very interesting, even if it's beyond the scope of this project. So that's all I have. Thanks for the opportunity to read this paper. I really enjoyed it, and great presentation, Wei-Yang, and thank you so much.